Today, we will explore a dramatic story about the relentless struggle between an individual and the forces manipulating power, where justice is finally served after years of deception and oppression. This is the story of Ryan Hayes, an heir to a family land who boldly confronted Laura Brooks and the Riverside Estates HOA board, those who exploited their power to seize the land and assets of the residents in the neighborhood. With financial fraud tactics, land record manipulation, and oppressive decisions, Laura and the HOA board turned the lives of innocent residents into endless suffering. But no one expected that, amidst the darkness of fraud, a resilient heir would rise up, uncover the truth, and fight to protect what belonged to his family. And even more, to protect the rights of the entire community. This story is not just a legal battle, but a testament to the strength of unity and perseverance. Ryan not only reclaimed his inherited land, but also helped the Riverside Estates community regain justice, building a fair, sustainable living environment that respects the rights of each individual. Throughout this story, many of you will likely feel anger at the manipulation and injustice that the Riverside Estates residents endured. The story is not just a lesson in fighting for justice, but a reminder of the power of a community standing up against oppression. We would love to hear your thoughts and opinions about the situations in this story. Do you think HOA power should be more strictly regulated? Or is there a way communities like Riverside Estates can protect themselves from such abuses of power? Don't forget to leave your thoughts and share your feelings in the comments. And make sure you don't miss the next chapter of this story, as more surprises and drama await. Watch until the end and join us in this journey to uncover justice. One June morning, when I was still deep in my late sleep after a long night in Riverside City, the phone suddenly rang. The sound of the ringtone startled me awake. When I looked at the screen, I saw only Mrs. Harris's number, the longtime neighbor of my grandfather for the past 40 years. I picked up the phone, expecting to hear a greeting or some usual news. But no, her voice trembled, so tense that I could hear her breath catching through the phone. Ryan, they're building houses on your land. They started digging yesterday. You need to come back immediately. A cold shiver ran down my spine. What are they doing on my land? I asked again, unable to believe what I had just heard. Mrs. Harris continued, her voice full of worry. They've put up signs and have construction machinery there. A huge excavator tearing up your family's land. I fear they'll trespass on everything. My mean spoon. How could this happen? That land was my inheritance from my grandfather, who had spent years protecting and maintaining it. I had heard him talk about all the plans to protect that land, and now it was being taken right before my eyes. My grandfather didn't sell the land to anyone. I muttered, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. I couldn't hesitate any longer. I immediately left the apartment and drove to Evergreen Farm. A feeling of unease weighed heavily on my chest, but I knew I had to get there right away. The road from Riverside to Evergreen Farm was a 5-hour drive, but the time seemed to stretch twice as long in my mind. With every mile, I felt my anxiety grow. The scenery outside the car window gradually changed, from the bustling, noisy city streets to the peaceful fields I had known since childhood. The narrow, winding roads took me through the lush green countryside. The tranquility of the countryside, which used to make me feel at peace, now felt strange, as if it had been invaded by an uncontrollable force. As I neared Evergreen Farm, I began to see drastic changes on the familiar road. The landscape was no longer the green fields and gentle hills I used to drive past since I was young. Instead, construction signs and the dust from the active machinery took over the space, creating a chaotic scene that I couldn't believe. The closer I got, the more I felt the stark difference. The booming sounds of machinery echoed across the formerly peaceful rural space. The engine noise, metal clanging against metal, and the roar of bulldozers tearing up the ground painted a chaotic picture, a far cry from the peaceful days when my grandfather had been here. The dirt road I used to stroll along had now become a noisy, dusty construction site. Dust filled the air, blurring the familiar images of the old wooden houses and winding roads, as if they were being forgotten in the frenzy of the giant machinery. The scene grew more intense when I saw a crew of workers in protective gear, moving like ghosts under the scorching sun, seemingly unaware of the pain I was experiencing. A giant excavator with a long arm plunged into the earth, cutting through a thick layer of soil, the muddy sludge flying into the air as if it were tearing apart the history of my family piece by piece. The sight made me dizzy as small chunks of dirt fell, creating thick clouds of dust that enveloped the whole space. The air felt heavy and suffocating. Another bulldozer moved across the ground, making me think of a giant monster swallowing up the land my grandfather had spent years nurturing. The earth was being ruthlessly torn up, and the trees that had once been lush were now left with deep scars, like wounds that were slowly spreading. The crops my grandfather had planted to provide food for the family had been destroyed, leaving no trace of life. Not far from there, I saw a huge sign standing tall in the dusty chaos, with bold letters. Future home of Riverside Estates, 72 luxury homes, starting at $600,000. The words hit me like a bucket of cold water, snapping me out of my daze. 72 luxurious homes, built on my family's land, the land my grandfather had protected for so many years. Every house, every square foot of land, was an invasion of a piece of memory, an unforgivable theft. The gusts of dust swept through, making me feel even more helpless. The scene before me made me feel like everything had been stolen, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Trucks carrying materials were constantly coming in and out of the construction site, roaring, their engines loud, but no one stopped to pay attention to the pain of someone watching their most familiar possessions being destroyed. Since my grandfather passed away, I hadn't been prepared for what was happening. This feeling is indescribable. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. The construction site was swallowing everything, memories, everything my grandfather had built over his life. When I stepped out of the car, I saw a woman standing apart from the workers. She wore a crisp white shirt and beige pants, standing with an air of confidence, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around her. I walked up to her and spoke, though an unsettling feeling rose inside me. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice trying to stay calm, even though my heart was in turmoil. She looked up, her gaze unfriendly. She extended her hand, very politely, but with no warmth. "We are preparing for a residential development project. I am Laura Brooks, president of the Riverside Estates Homeowners Association." She spoke in a tone as if I were someone who didn't understand the situation. A surge of anger rose in me. "This is my land," I said, no longer holding back. "My grandfather, William Hayes, owned this land, and I am the heir." She just smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be mistaken. This land was bought by us last year, and we have all the proper permits." She continued coldly, as though she were talking about an object, not the land my family had cherished for generations. I couldn't believe what she was saying. "I don't believe it. I want to see all the documentation proving it." I wasn't about to leave without clear answers. She handed me a business card, then turned and walked away, unconcerned. I stood there, feeling abandoned, watching the excavators continue to destroy what my grandfather had preserved. When I couldn't bear the sight any longer, I turned back to the car and drove back to Evergreen Farm. I couldn't do anything else. I knew I had to get answers immediately, and there was only one place to go. That was my grandfather's office. My grandfather's office, which had long been the place where I found peace during my visits, was eerily silent now. Stepping into the room, I couldn't help but feel as though he were still sitting there, in his old wooden chair, with the dim oil lamp and the books scattered on the desk. But he was no longer there. The room still held the image of a time that could never be returned, but it also seemed to hold secrets that I needed to uncover. The smell of old cigarettes and dust covered the room, as if time had stopped the moment he passed. The faint smell of the faded books and the yellowing pages made me feel as if I were reliving the old memories. The room was full of memories, with old newspapers, notebooks recording all the events of his life, and family photos that had turned yellow. Everything spoke of a past that had passed, but I needed to find something that could help me address the current situation. I walked around the room, my eyes scanning the bookshelves, the boxes, and the old photos on the walls. A sense of disappointment grew as I didn't find anything useful. I turned back to my grandfather's desk, where he had sat every night writing his notes about work, the farm, and the things he saw during the day. The drawers had not been opened in a long time, and the ledgers were piled up high. I opened each drawer, searching through the old papers, but found nothing that could help me resolve my current questions. Only when I touched the old wooden desk did something unexpected happen. A faint creak sounded from under the desk, and I sensed an irregularity in the desk. Something wasn't right. I bent down, looked closer, and then discovered a loose board, almost forgotten for years. With my hand, I gently lifted the board. I swallowed hard, my heart racing as I saw a small metal box hidden beneath it. The box was made of old metal, with scratches and signs of wear from time. I slowly opened the box, and what was inside made my heart skip a beat. A pile of papers was tightly packed inside. The first was my grandfather's will, clearly stating that he had left this land to me. All the property was mine upon his death. This not only reassured me, but also confirmed my legal rights to the land. I sat down in my grandfather's old chair, my eyes still fixed on the words in the letter. This was a message my grandfather had left for me, a warning, a clear directive that I had to follow to protect my family in this land. If you're reading this letter, it means you're facing those who wish to take what we have worked so hard to build. They will not give up easily, but you must remember that everything belongs to you. Never let them take our family's property without resistance. As I read these words, I felt my heart tighten. My grandfather was not just a farmer, but a wise man who had foreseen that some would try to seize this land. The land was not just property. It was the soul of my family, of generations who had carefully nurtured it. He had known this battle would not be easy, and he had prepared everything for me to continue. They tried to deceive me into selling the land, but I refused. The people from Riverside Estates used all sorts of tactics to convince me, from empty promises to unclear contracts. But I never signed any papers. You must remember, the papers they give you are not trustworthy. Everything is a lie. If you want to protect this land, you must find the original documents, especially the maps from 1910. My grandfather emphasized the importance of these original documents. The old land maps were the most solid evidence to prove my family's ownership. I could picture in my mind the image of my grandfather sitting at his desk, his eyes old but determined, and the memories of times when he refused to sell the land, times when he was firm in not letting anyone take what belonged to our family. I understood that these maps were the key to proving the truth. In the letter, he continued, "These documents are not easy to find. They have been carefully hidden. You must find them, and when you do, you will see the truth. The truth will help you protect this land. Remember, if you do nothing, if you let them take it, we will have nothing left." My grandfather's final message struck a chord deep within me. I realized he had prepared for this battle, knowing that one day I would have to face these greedy people, those willing to do anything to seize our family's property. My grandfather had not just left me an inheritance, but also a valuable lesson in resilience and the protection of sacred values. The weight of responsibility was heavier than ever. This was not just a fight for the land, but for the family legacy, for those who had carefully built and protected it over the years. My grandfather trusted me, passed all this responsibility to me, and I couldn't let him down. As I folded the letter, I felt a new strength rise within me. His directions were a guiding light, and I would not back down. I stood up, regained my composure and determination, and looked at the metal box with the important documents, the land maps, and evidence I needed to uncover. I knew I had to continue searching for the original documents, especially the maps from 1910. These documents would be the legal tools that would help me protect not only this land, but also my family, protecting what my grandfather had worked so hard to build and leave to us. What I was doing was not just for me, but for my grandfather, for the legacy, and for all the generations who had been tied to this land. There was no more time to delay. I knew I needed help from someone who understood the law. Gregory Finch was the only person I could trust in this town. He was experienced in land disputes and always respected for his caution and skill in the job. He was not easily deceived by trickery, and I needed someone like him to help me deal with the greedy people from Riverside Estates. After leaving Evergreen Farm, I called Gregory and asked for an urgent meeting. He agreed to meet me that afternoon at 3 p.m. at his office. I knew I would be facing a long and difficult legal battle, but I had no other choice. I couldn't let these intruders destroy everything my family had worked for. When I walked into Gregory's office, he was sitting behind his desk, deeply focused on some documents. His serious expression, but bright eyes, always made me feel at ease. I took out the metal box I had found in my grandfather's office and placed it on the table in front of him. "Gregory, I need your help," I said, my voice firm but filled with anxiety. "I found these documents at Evergreen Farm. These are old land maps and my grandfather's will. According to these documents, I discovered that my family's land is being unlawfully trespassed. The people from Riverside Estates are building on my land without proper consent." Gregory stayed silent for a few seconds, flipping through the papers in the box. His eyes lit up when he saw the old land maps, and I could tell he was thinking carefully. "These maps are very important." Gregory finally spoke, his voice full of certainty. "You did a great job finding these documents. According to these maps from 1910, the boundaries of your family's land are much larger than what the current records show. This could be strong evidence to prove your family's ownership." A sense of relief washed over me when I heard his words. But I knew this was just the first step. "But we need to prove that the changes in the land records are unlawful," Gregory continued. "We will need to check the county records to see who made these changes and how we can reverse that decision." We decided to go to the county office that afternoon. I felt tense, but also determined. This was an opportunity to restore my family's rights, and I couldn't let it slip away. When we arrived at the county office, the atmosphere seemed very quiet. The land records were carefully stored, but everything seemed to be neglected. We met a county clerk named Angela, who was responsible for storing the land records. After explaining the situation and asking to see the records related to my family's land, Angela agreed and led us into a room filled with old documents. Gregory began studying the documents Angela provided. Every sheet of paper, every map was carefully examined by him. Meanwhile, I just stood still, watching his every move, feeling like time was dragging on. After a long while, Gregory stopped, his sharp gaze focused. "We've found it," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of confusion. "The changes in these land records were clearly made without your grandfather's consent. A small change was made in 1984, but later, in 1997, a large change took place, reducing your family's land boundaries by nearly 80 acres. Notably, these documents are signed by your grandfather, and there are signs they may have been forged." A rush of anger and worry surged within me. Everything I had thought was clear now seemed like an obvious fraud. The people from Riverside Estates had used forged documents to legitimize the takeover of my family's land. Gregory looked at me. "Ryan, we have the evidence. This could be a solid legal basis for us to reverse these changes and protect your family's rights." My investigation had entered a new phase, and it felt like I was diving deeper into a maze with no way out. Every trace, every clue I found brought me closer to the truth. But at the same time, it made me feel like I was being pulled into a dangerous whirlpool where everything was no longer as simple as I thought. One cold morning, after completing the review of the documents at the county office, I sat back in Gregory Finch's office, trying to connect the scattered pieces. Beside me was a pile of faded documents, copies of papers, and scribbled notes I had gathered. Gregory had left for a while, giving me space to think about what I had discovered. I still couldn't forget the sharp look in his eyes when we uncovered the unlawful changes in the land records. But one question continued to haunt me. Who was behind all this? And then, like a flash of lightning in my mind, I began to connect the dots. The old maps I had found showed that not only had my family's land been invaded, but there was also a much larger network. It felt like there was some force behind it, manipulating everything from the shadows. I needed to clarify this. I needed to know who was pulling the strings. Following the trail, I began investigating suspicious financial transactions related to Riverside Estates. The papers I had collected earlier pointed to some strange contracts. All the contracts related to Riverside Estates had several unfamiliar names appearing repeatedly. I sighed, realizing that all of these names had one thing in common. They weren't strangers, but people holding power in this area. I touched the documents related to real estate transactions. One of them clearly stated that Riverside Estates had received a huge loan from a financial company called Sunshine Consulting LLC, which had close ties with several local government officials. As I continued to review the records, I discovered a series of suspicious money transfers from the HOA to related companies. Companies that not only backed Riverside Estates, but also had shady connections with members of the board. "Here it is," I whispered, when I saw a string of transactions transferring money from the HOA account to Laura Brooks' personal account. A large sum of money, perhaps compensation or even a commission from land deals. Each transaction was not only suspicious in timing, but also had odd discrepancies in the amounts, as if they were trying to hide something. I felt tense with every breath, knowing I was stepping into dangerous territory. An undeniable truth was slowly revealing itself. Laura Brooks, the HOA president, and the board members had not only been involved in illegal land transactions, they had manipulated the entire financial system of this area, exploiting their power and connections to seize land from vulnerable residents, coercing them into selling their properties for pennies on the dollar. I couldn't stop thinking about the people who had been deceived, blackmailed by the very people they trusted, like Mr. Grayson, who had to sell his land after a series of unreasonable fines from the HOA, or other families who were forced to pay exorbitant, unexplained fees, making it impossible for them to keep their land. And now, these people were trying to take my family's land. It was time for me to act, but I couldn't do this alone. I needed to gather more evidence, dig deeper into this web of fraud. I needed to follow all these traces until the truth was exposed. I stood up, walked toward the window of Gregory's office, looking outside with a heavy heart. It felt as though I had touched a dark corner of the world that no one wanted to face. But I couldn't stop. I would go all the way, even if I had to face the most powerful people in this town. My eyes stared at the foggy clouds on the horizon, a new determination forming within me. Manipulation, fraud, all of it would be exposed, and I would be the one to bring that truth to light. Finally, after days of intense investigation and gathering irrefutable evidence, I was ready for a direct confrontation with Laura Brooks and those behind Riverside Estates. The Riverside Estates community meeting was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, July 12, 2022, according to the Homeowners Association's notice. This was the annual meeting, but this time it was special because I decided to reveal the truth about the shady deals and manipulations that Laura and the HOA board had carried out. Over 200 residents of Riverside Estates were present in the hall, from homeowners who had bought properties in the development to those who had been forced to sell their land under pressure from the HOA. They all came to hear the latest information about the project and important decisions regarding the community. But I didn't come here to hear Laura Brooks' empty promises. I came here to tell the truth. When I entered the hall, everyone's eyes were on me. I knew that what I was about to do would surprise many, but it was also time for them to know the truth that Laura had tried to conceal for so long. My heart raced, but I couldn't back down. I walked straight to the podium, opened a briefcase containing important documents, the original land maps from 1910, the shady financial transactions, and the evidence I had gathered. I began with a confident statement. I am Ryan Hayes, the rightful heir to Evergreen Farm, and I am here today to protect the rights of my family and all of you, the deceived residents. I raised the original land map, pointing to the clear boundaries from 1910. This land does not belong to Riverside Estates. You have no right to build on it. My family's land was illegally seized, and I have proof of that. Laura Brooks immediately stood up, trying to maintain her composure. This is nonsense. Our permits are completely legal, she protested, trying to shut down my accusations. I don't care about your permits, I coldly replied. I care about the shady financial transactions that you and your board have been involved in. What you've done is manipulate the system to seize my family's property, and I have the evidence. I presented the documents, pointing to a specific transaction. In 1997, the boundaries of my family's land were changed without legal consent. 80 acres of our land were cut off and transferred to Riverside Estates. This is an illegal change. People in the hall began to murmur, residents exchanging looks, eyes filled with doubt about what Laura had been saying. Not only that, I continued. Riverside Estates took a $16 million loan from Sunshine Consulting LLC, a company with close ties to Laura and the HOA members. These funds were transferred into her personal account and others in the board, manipulating land transactions and ownership. Laura stood up quickly, her eyes blazing with fury. This is slander. I can't let you continue lying to everyone, she yelled. I did not back down. You can keep protesting, but the truth is clear. This is your document from Riverside Estates, and I have all the evidence. You cannot deny it anymore." My words brought an eerie silence over the hall. The residents around me began to talk, whispers filling the air, and I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. Laura tried to maintain her calm, but I could clearly see the worry in her eyes. "You'll pay for these accusations," Laura said in a threatening tone, but with less power than before. "You can't do anything. The town officials, those here, they'll stand with Riverside Estates." I smiled, but I didn't let her gain the upper hand. "You think those officials can help you? You think they can stop me from revealing the truth? I don't need the support of the corrupt. I have the support of this community." The residents began to stand up, clapping and speaking out. A man from the back started speaking. "You're right, Ryan. We've been deceived for too long." The entire hall started clapping, and the applause grew louder. The people of Riverside Estates, those who had been forced to sell their land, those who had suffered under the HOA's manipulation, were now standing up and showing their support. Laura no longer had the strength to resist. She just stood still, her face pale, unable to say another word. "From today, all these transactions will be investigated. I won't let you and your board continue to deceive us," I said, my voice firm. Finally, Laura lowered her head and walked out, not saying another word. The confrontation was over, and I knew I had gained the support of this community. The land was no longer just my family's. It was for all those who had been deceived by Riverside Estates. The atmosphere in the hall was completely different from when I first entered. The residents of Riverside Estates were no longer silent, no longer waiting for Laura Brooks' ridiculous excuses. They started standing up, eyes full of determination. Something inside me had completely changed, and I could feel the growing unity of this community. I was no longer alone. Every eye in a room was on me, and I knew I couldn't back down. I turned to face the crowd, speaking loudly and clearly. "We can't continue letting these corrupt people deceive us. Laura Brooks and the HOA members have exploited their power to force you to sell your land, to push you into unreasonable fees, and they have stolen our property. We must stand up, protect our rights, and the rights of the families they've taken from." The clapping began again, louder than ever. Margaret Turner, a 68-year-old woman, stood up, her voice trembling but determined. "I've lived in Riverside Estates for 40 years. This land, this house, it's all mine. But for years, the HOA has constantly tried to force me to comply with unreasonable regulations. 2 years ago, I planted a small flower garden in my front yard. The colorful flowers made this neighborhood feel more alive. But shortly after, they sent me a letter saying I violated the landscaping rules. They told me I had to remove the whole garden or be fined $1,000 a month. I tried to protest, but they said if I didn't comply, they'd seize my land." She paused for a moment, looking around, then continued. "In the end, I had no choice but to remove the garden because I couldn't handle the fines anymore. And I know this is just one of many tactics they use to force people like me to sell land or reduce our property. Today, I'm here to say I will no longer be silent." Richard Bennett, an elderly man, stood up and gave a forced smile. "I've lived here since Riverside Estates was founded. I've been attached to this land for 50 years, but I've never seen the HOA act so ruthlessly. They demanded I fix my yard's fence, saying it didn't meet the community standards. But my fence wasn't damaged. It was just an old wooden fence, not harming anyone. Then they fined me $500 and demanded I repair it within a week, or they'd fine me more." He paused and looked directly into Laura Brooks' eyes. "And the worst part is, when I couldn't fix it in time, they sent me a notice saying I violated the regulations and began the process to seize part of my land. I had to sell part of my land to pay off the fine. If I didn't, they would force me to sell my entire property. It's shameful that the government and the HOA side with the rich, letting them manipulate and squeeze people like me." Sarah Jenkins, a single mother, stood up and shared her story. "A few years ago, my husband, Tom, and I bought a small plot in Riverside Estates. When I decided to plant a vegetable garden for our family, they said growing vegetables violated regulations because it didn't meet the aesthetic landscaping standards. I couldn't believe it when I got a notice from the HOA saying we had to remove the garden or face a fine. My husband, who was seriously ill at the time, couldn't do anything, so I had to comply. But the problem didn't stop there." Sarah sighed and continued. "They started imposing enormous and unclear fees. Service fees for maintaining common areas, landscaping adjustment fees. It all piled up into a debt I couldn't afford. Eventually, they said that if we didn't pay, they would sell our house. I couldn't take it anymore, and we had to sell the house for much less than its actual value. Not just the land, but my family lost our home because of the HOA's abuse. Peter McKinney, a young man, stood up and looked around. I bought a house in Riverside Estates 2 years ago, and I have to say, what I went through was shameful. When I moved here, I just wanted a peaceful life. But everything changed as soon as I started renovating my yard. I replaced the old walls in the yard just to make it nicer. But soon after, the HOA sent me a letter demanding I change everything because it didn't comply with the community's general standards. They even threatened that if I didn't comply, I would be fined $200 per month. Peter paused for a moment, then continued in a lower voice. And then a month later, I received another notice from the HOA. They said I violated the house color regulations and demanded I repaint the house. I really couldn't understand what was going on. After some time, they notified me I violated other regulations I'd never heard of, and they would keep fining me, even threatening to seize my property if I didn't pay. I knew this was their tactic to force people like me to sell land. At this point, the unity of the community was no longer just words but action. They were determined not to let those who manipulated continue to use their power to oppress the vulnerable. And I, Ryan Hayes, was not only the heir of Evergreen Farm, but the one who would lead them to justice. We will stand up and fight, I declared, my voice resonating with determination. We will not let these corrupt individuals seize this land. Each one of us has the right to protect what belongs to us, and I will never give up until justice is served. The applause grew louder than ever, a commitment from everyone in the room. They were ready to confront Laura Brooks and those in the HOA, ready to fight for their rights. That meeting became a turning point in the battle against the manipulation of Laura Brooks and those in the HOA. The stories of the residents made me realize one important thing. They were not just victims, but they were people who could change everything if they stood together. I couldn't fight this system alone. We needed a strong organization that could protect the rights of every resident in Riverside Estates and confront the illegal actions the HOA had carried out for many years. We can't let this deception continue, I said, my voice full of resolve as I stood up in the next meeting. Laura Brooks and the HOA board can't keep manipulating us. But if we only fight on our own, we will fail. We need to unite and build a strong organization, one that can protect the rights of all residents and confront their schemes. I paused for a second, letting my words echo through the room. I propose we form the Meadow Creek Homeowners Coalition, an association of Riverside Estates residents, with the goal of protecting our rights. Every decision in this community must be made transparently and fairly, and no one will be able to abuse their power to harm us anymore. A wave of quiet discussion began to spread through the hall, but gradually, the residents began to show support. Sarah Jenkins stood up first, her eyes full of resolve. I agree with Ryan, she said, her voice firm. We've been suffering from the HOA's unreasonable rules for too long. Every time we do something small wrong, they fine us or threaten to sell our land. We need an organization that can stand up for us. Soon after, Richard Bennett, the man who had shared the story about his yard fence, also stood up. I support Ryan's idea. We need a collective strength, so we're not manipulated by these people anymore. I lost land and money because of them, but I won't let that happen to others in this community. The feeling of unity and determination spread through the hall. One by one, each person, each family stood up, sharing stories of the oppression they had endured. Their eyes were now filled with hope, no longer fear. They had realized they weren't facing Laura Brooks and Riverside Estates alone anymore. I will fight with you, said Margaret Turner, the woman who had been forced to remove her flower garden. I've had enough of being threatened and fined by people who don't understand this community. If we have an association, at least we will have the strength to protect our rights. People began clapping, the solidarity growing louder. I looked around, feeling like I was no longer just an heir fighting for land, but the leader of a movement for justice. Laura Brooks could no longer threaten us. This community, we had united and were determined. The Meadow Creek Homeowners Coalition was not just an organization protecting the rights of residents, but a symbol of the fight for fairness. We would stand up against abuse and protect what belonged to us. After the truth was revealed, not only Laura Brooks, but also the HOA board faced serious legal consequences. Investigations and evidence of financial fraud, shady transactions, and illegal changes in land records made it impossible for Laura and her accomplices to continue manipulating the community. Once the evidence was made public, Laura and the HOA members were investigated by federal and local authorities. The police and financial investigators got involved, collecting additional evidence from bank accounts, transaction records, and fraudulent contracts they had signed. The shady relationship between Laura and local officials was also confirmed, leading to a series of extensive investigations into corruption within the local government. Laura Brooks was charged with multiple serious offenses, including fraud, abuse of power, and financial manipulation. She was arrested and faced trial. After months of hearings, Laura was sentenced to 10 years in prison for fraud and financial manipulation. The accomplices in the HOA, as well as those involved in changing land boundaries and seizing property, were also sentenced to prison or faced other severe penalties. The illegal money they had taken was ordered to be returned, and a portion was reimbursed to the harmed Riverside Estates residents. The Riverside Estates community not only regained their land, but also reclaimed their rights, which had been stolen for many years. The residents also filed a lawsuit against the HOA for abuse and fraud, demanding back some of the property and illegal fees that the HOA had taken from them over the years. The harmed residents were compensated, and the fraudulent actions of Laura and the HOA board could no longer be tolerated. With the charges confirmed and Laura Brooks and her accomplices sentenced, justice had been served. The Riverside Estates community was no longer manipulated by corrupt individuals. Every decision in this community was now made transparently and fairly, and the community began to thrive, no longer suffering from the unreasonable regulations and fees imposed by the HOA. The Meadow Creek Homeowners Coalition became a strong organization, protecting the legal rights of residents and confronting the schemes of corrupt individuals. A year later, Evergreen Farm was not only the inheritance of my family, but it had become a symbol of justice and resilience. The land my grandfather had painstakingly built was now not only where I preserved the family's legacy, but also where the values of fairness and transparency were celebrated. New homes were built with environmentally friendly designs, using recycled materials and renewable energy, with transparent and fair management systems to create a sustainable community in harmony with nature. The Riverside Estates community thrived, with residents no longer threatened by unreasonable fees or rules imposed by the HOA. All decisions were made fairly, without manipulation from people like Laura Brooks. The residents now lived in harmony with nature and respected the legacy my grandfather had left behind. The homes were designed with environmental friendliness in mind, with common areas, green gardens, and open spaces where families could enjoy outdoor living. Solar power systems and energy-saving solutions were widely implemented, helping reduce environmental impact and improving the quality of life for residents. This community was not just where we lived, but where we built a sustainable and fair future together. Everyone in Riverside Estates now had their rights protected, and all participated in the management of the community in a transparent and fair way. The unity of the community created a harmonious living environment where everyone respected each other and worked together to develop this neighborhood. Looking back at Evergreen Farm, I no longer saw just an inheritance, but proof of my family's ongoing battle and the community's. We fought together to protect the core values of fairness and freedom. The houses now weren't just buildings, but symbols of resilience and the power of a community to fight against injustice. The Riverside Estates community has undergone a complete transformation. The oppressed residents have regained their power and can now live freely in a fair environment, where they no longer have to endure manipulation and abuse of power. Evergreen Farm is now not just my family's legacy, but also part of a sustainable and just community. The story of Ryan Hayes and his legal battle with Laura Brooks and the Riverside Estates HOA board is a living testament to the power of resilience and determination in the fight for justice. Financial investigations, the exposure of fraudulent actions, and the abuse of power have restored justice to its rightful place. Laura and her accomplices faced appropriate legal consequences, and the Riverside Estates community can now live in a transparent, fair, and sustainable environment. But this story is not just Ryan's or his family's victory. It is the victory of the entire community. The residents of Riverside Estates, after years of being manipulated, have regained their voice. They stood together, fighting not just for their own rights, but also for the core values of fairness and the protection of everyone's legal rights. Now, Evergreen Farm is not just Ryan's family inheritance, but also a symbol of justice and resilience. The homes that have been rebuilt are not only made from sustainable materials, but also embody human values, representing unity and determination to never back down. So, what do you think about the situations in this story? Should HOA organizations be more tightly regulated to prevent the abuse of power and negative impacts on the community? Please share your thoughts in the comments, as this story does not end here. It opens an important dialogue about how we protect our rights and the community around us. Thank you for following this dramatic story. Don't forget to follow and continue reading the upcoming stories, where we will bring deeper insights into law, politics, and life.